Good evening, and welcome to White Angle. I'm Brendan Fallon. Before we get started tonight, please remember to like and subscribe if you're enjoying our channel. So tonight we're going to be looking at the Electoral College vote and signs of President Trump's preparations for a possible major counteroffensive. So we know that December 14th was the voting day for the U.S. Electoral College, where electors in each state have voted for the president and the vice president. The results from each state will now be sent to Congress for final certification by both houses of Congress on January 6th next year. And of course, the leftist media has already happily announced that Biden is the officially elected next president. You may wonder, the Electoral College has already voted. Does it mean that President Trump can no longer reverse the election? Is there no way that the truth can now be unveiled? Well, that's not quite the case yet. As mentioned in the last episode, President Trump still has at least 3 alternative options. Let's briefly review them again. The first option is the legal battle, which is to continue to fight for rights and truth through the legal process, and to request that the disputed states revoke the certification of the election results. However, this is almost impossible at the moment. From the district court to the Supreme Court, they have ignored the evidence of fraud or rejected the cases. The legal battle is very time-consuming as well. Now that the Electoral College has finished voting, this option is a little bit too slow to help, and the chances of winning are low. However, there's been an unanticipated twist wrought by the Republicans in the state legislatures of those contested states. On the day of the Electoral College vote, these Republican-dominated state legislatures also put up their own Republican electors to vote for President Trump. It's a rather unusual tactic. Therefore, the Republican approach in the state legislatures is to actually advance to the second half of the process, that is, arranging for the Electoral College to elect the president. However, the key is the first half. That is, the court must first reject the local election results, which is the most important premise. If this happens, the Electoral College elected by the state legislatures will become effective. Otherwise, the second half of the process cannot proceed. In line with this, the Republican Party of Pennsylvania has issued a statement stating, quote, "We took this procedural vote to preserve legal claims that may be presented going forward." This was in no way an effort to usurp or contest the will of the Pennsylvania voters. In other words, if the future election results in Pennsylvania are overturned by the courts, there is a chance that today's election results in the state legislature will be replaced by the electoral votes for President Trump. The second option is the Congress battle. That is, on January 6th, when the Congress certifies the results of the electoral votes in each state, members of the House of Representatives and the Senate will come forward to challenge the results of the disputed states, and then the 2 houses of Congress will negotiate to decide whether to reject the electoral votes of certain states. If this option can reject Biden's electoral votes and reduce them to less than 270, it will trigger the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which means that when no candidate receives more than half of the votes, the House of Representatives will elect the president, and the Senate will elect the vice president. Now, the details of this procedure we have already discussed in our last episode, and there is a certain degree of difficulty in the implementation of this procedure, which we will not repeat here. Those who are interested can watch this episode of the program. The third and most powerful alternative option is President Trump's exercise of presidential prerogative power, which is the special rights granted by the U.S. Constitution to the president to respond to crises when the country is in a state of emergency, including declaring a national emergency, martial law, and so on. This option allows the president to mobilize the military to support the investigation of the election and the arrest of insurgents. But it is also the most controversial option. At the end of the day, no matter what degree of martial law it is, it will bring certain restrictions on people's civil liberties, freedom of movement, etc. But since America has now entered an extraordinary period, it may be necessary to take extraordinary measures to deal with it. Why? In this US election, lots of evidence, witnesses, and signs of irregularities have emerged and come into the public view. You could see dead people voting, non-citizens voting, and ballots being packed into suitcases and hidden under tables. You could also see that Republican poll watchers in many districts were prevented from monitoring ballots. And in Detroit, ballots soared from 7,000 to 130,000 within just 2 hours of opening. Of course, there is also the world-famous Biden curve and other bizarre signs that don't need any professional commentary. People can easily tell by common sense that something is wrong and that there must be something abnormal behind the election. But the judicial systems at all levels, local government officials, and the mainstream leftist media have turned a blind eye to this. Even the Supreme Court has chosen not to acknowledge it. So in effect, the Trump camp's legal battle has been thwarted, and the truth about this election cannot be exposed via the judiciary. This is indulging the fraudulent groups, the swamp, the web of bad actors, allowing them to trample and destroy America's liberal democracy, allowing them to deprive American people of the natural human rights and equal rights that the Constitution has guaranteed, and allowing them to carry out a blatant coup against the government, which was elected by the American people. Moreover, if the truth about this fraud is not exposed, it will put American constitutional democracy at risk, making it impossible to determine who is the true majority choice of the people. At the same time, this election fraud or coup would not only deprive the people of their freedom and equality, but also plunge the country into a crisis of distrust, possibly resulting in secession or civil war. For example, currently in the US, we don't trust the so-called mainstream media because there is too much falsehood and political manipulation. We can't even trust the results of Google and Wikipedia when we research online, because they are all part of the web of bad actors. For political purposes, they've deleted speeches on a massive scale to make the news we see fit one consistent narrative, excluding all other points of view or voices. Therefore, this is definitely not a simple issue of winning or losing an election, but a critical choice concerning the future of the United States, the future of the world, and to many, the future of mankind. It is really a crossroads for the world and human history. Will the United States retain its traditional values and liberal democracy in the future? Or will it move to the left and towards socialism? Today, you are witnessing a crucial defense battle. What's more, foreign powers, including the Chinese Communist Party, Cuba, Venezuela, and others, are suspected of intervening in the election and manipulating the results in conjunction with the alt-left forces in the United States. This is tantamount to subversion and a coup by foreign enemies. It is a serious threat to national security. Therefore, at this extraordinary time, when national security is under both foreign and domestic threats, the US president may need to use extraordinary methods to deal with this unprecedented national crisis. In fact, there have been at least 68 declarations of martial law in US history, but the only national martial law was declared by President Abraham Lincoln in 1861 in response to the Civil War. He suspended habeas corpus, despite opposition from judges and the media. He forcibly arrested 14,000 political prisoners and shut down more than 300 newspapers. Finally, under President Lincoln's leadership, the United States eventually ended the Civil War, returned the country to peace, and abolished slavery. President Lincoln came to be regarded as the greatest president in the history of the United States, and laid the foundation for the development of the United States as the world's leading nation. Now the US is facing even more crises than it did during Lincoln's time. So the use of presidential prerogative power is a serious prospect for cleaning up America's foreign and domestic enemies. So now let's look at how President Trump would implement presidential prerogative power. It's said that extreme times call for extreme measures. We've seen a massive departure from rule of law, and things like the intimidation of witnesses and harassment of witnesses, their families, a Attorney Linwood disclosed on the 14th that they had received news that judges and their families were being threatened. This led to many courts refusing to accept cases and unwilling to acknowledge evidence of fraudulent behavior. President Trump has repeatedly asked the controversial state of Georgia to compare the signatures on the ballots and envelopes. Georgia State Governor Brian Kemp also relented at the end of November and expressed support, but his daughter's boyfriend, Harrison Deal, suddenly died in a violent car accident in early December. The governor then immediately changed his words and said he was unwilling to support President Trump's proposal. Now, I'm not in the business of spreading conspiracy theories, but these circumstances are at least a little bit suspect. So this web of bad actors is not just attempting to seize power, they're also threatening and harming people. In contrast to the idea of rule of law, we're seeing the elements of a rule of terror, the likes of which reflects what was happening in the former Soviet Union. If this organization is really allowed to rule the country, will that be a blessing or a curse for the United States? If American constitutional democracy and American human rights disappear, people around the world who yearn for freedom will lose their hope. Totalitarian dictators around the world will then expand their desire for domination without limitation. In that case, would it be a blessing or a curse for the world? Therefore, I think it's very necessary for the Trump administration to seriously consider using the presidential prerogative power to deal with the current internal and external crisis in the United States. On the one hand, it can be used to investigate and expose the truth behind the election. On the other hand, to track down and crack down on any foreign or domestic forces that participated in the election fraud and who tried to subvert the United States. So how could President Trump exercise his prerogative powers? As I've explained before, and I'll reiterate here, the process can be explained through 4 basic steps. The first step is to declare a state of national emergency, which will give the president at least 136 prerogative powers, including the power to impose martial law. The second step is to release all incriminating evidence on the suspected fraudulent group. The president must release detailed and strong evidence in order to definitively convict this group of subversives and to allow both parties to understand and be convinced of the truth, thus reducing controversy. The third step is to implement a limited martial law to minimize the impact on the people. The president should be allowed to mobilize the military to take over some or all of the executive and judicial powers, so as to get rid of the constraints of the Washington swamp or deep state and investigate the truth behind the fraud and coup. The fourth step involves the Insurrection Act. This would mean a declaration against the insurgents and then demand that they disband. This would probably be followed by military raids and arrests and then court hearings. After the dust settled, the president would be able to lift the martial law. Of course, hearing about martial law and the military may cause many people to think that we are entering an authoritarian era and that we are engaged in a dictatorial struggle. But in fact, we are not. The US has already been plunged into an unprecedented internal crisis because of this election coup. And the US has already lost prestige in the international community. If America cannot resolutely deal with its internal and external enemies and expose the truth about the fraud and the coup, then it may not only be heading towards internal disintegration or civil war, but may also be infiltrated, plundered, and devoured by foreign enemies. If the United States loses its strength as the world's #1 power, the Chinese Communist Party will surely take advantage of the opportunity to dominate the world, and the world will fall under the threat of the communist red tide. So, will President Trump resort to using his presidential prerogative powers? Will he choose to declare martial law, mobilize military forces to take out the enemy, and investigate the truth of the election? Personally, I think Trump does intend to do so, and is already laying the necessary groundwork and sending out signals step by step. What are these signals? There are at least 6 signals that indicate President Trump is preparing for a military counterattack. Signal 1 was the declaration of a national emergency in 2018. As we mentioned previously, Trump signed an executive order on September 12, 2018, declaring a state of emergency in response to foreign powers interfering in the U.S. domestic elections. Once people, institutions, or companies at home or abroad are found to be involved in interfering in the U.S. elections, the U.S. government can block the assets of these people and organizations. This emergency proclamation or declaration is still in effect today. Moreover, the executive order requires the Director of National Intelligence to submit a report to the President within 45 days of the election, explaining the interference of foreign forces in the election. Voting day this year was November 3rd, so December 18th is the deadline for report submission. Once President Trump obtains the report regarding foreign and domestic interference in the election, he will have the evidence he needs to go after the fraudulent groups. Signal 2, replacement of the Secretary of Defense and direct command of Special Forces. After the election, President Trump announced the removal of the Secretary of Defense and replaced him with Chris Miller, Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Not only did Miller have a military and counterterrorism background, he also immediately announced that he would require the special operations to report directly to him, instead of through the original bureaucratic channels. Why bypass the original channels? One plausible explanation could be that President Trump has already planned to eliminate and bypass the spies and moles inside the government in order to directly mobilize the Special Operations Forces for special tasks where necessary. So he cannot leak the information in advance to avoid letting the deep state's dark forces know. Signal 3, 82nd Airborne Division reveals the storm is coming. On December 7th, President Trump announced to the public that big things were about to happen. On the next day, December 8th, the Texas Attorney General announced the indictment of the disputed 4 states, accusing them of unconstitutional election procedures. On the same day, the 82nd Airborne Division, a well-known U.S. Armed Forces unit, posted an article on Facebook with only 4 short words, quote, "A storm is coming." Attached to the article were a number of training photos of the 82nd Airborne Division. The following day, the 82nd Airborne Division issued another article saying, quote, "This will remain the land of the free so long as it is the home of the brave." Obviously, this passage is quoted from the last line of the American national anthem, "The land of the free and the home of the brave." The implication is that the 82nd Division will fight for American freedom. This kind of messaging is quite rare for the usually conservative military. Signal 4 is the classification of the election as coup and a crime for the first time. While President Trump has spoken about widespread election fraud many times, it's only recently that he's implied that it's underscored by a highly orchestrated coup plot. On December 10th, President Trump cited a U.S. media report on Twitter in which an interviewee said, quote, "The fact that our country is being stolen, a coup is taking place in front of our eyes." Also on December 13th, President Trump tweeted publicly that the swing states in dispute could not illegally certify their election results, otherwise they were, quote, "committing a severely punishable crime." Essentially, President Trump is escalating the classification of this election fraud step by step, from fraud to coup d'etat and crime. While fraud may represent a deception of the people and a violation of national law, a coup d'etat equates to something far more serious: treason against the country. This gives more justification to President Trump potentially using the military to investigate, arrest, and charge these criminals. Signal 5, President Trump visited West Point as a possible symbol of his future alliance with the military. On December 12th, a large number of Americans held a rally in Washington, D.C. to show their support for President Trump and call to stop the steal. Curiously, Trump did not make a personal appearance that day, but instead took a helicopter to the United States Military Academy, West Point, in New York, to watch the annual Army-Navy football game. President Trump arrived at West Point and was warmly welcomed by the Army and Navy cadets. Even though this is the 3rd year in a row that President Trump has attended the game, it could be more than a coincidence that with the air thick with tensions of the election, President Trump still flew there in person. I think that President Trump's visit to West Point is to deliberately show his rivals that while you have already controlled the DOJ, the FBI, the CIA, etc., the military is now fighting alongside me in the Patriots camp. It also signals that President Trump has been preparing to use his presidential prerogative power step by step. Signal 6. A mysterious code word appeared at both West Point and in Washington. On the day of President Trump's trip to West Point, an obscure and mysterious symbol was displayed on one of the 4 helicopters that were deployed to West Point. On the tail of the first helicopter was a skull symbol and the number 659. A number of Trump-watching netizens quickly identified this as a code used by President Trump's secret team. 659 refers to the number 659 post sent by the secret team 2 years ago. Of course, we can't name the secret team because it is like that other sensitive word, deep state, and will be heavily censored. The post mentions the president freeing the good people and includes the words Freedom Day and light. And most intriguing of all, the phrase, quote, the shot heard around the world. Curiously, Trump's former National Security Advisor, General Flynn, who was in Washington, D.C. that day to speak to the crowd, also mentioned, quote, the shot heard around the world. Too many coincidences could mean plans and arrangements made behind the scenes. Okay, so let's summarize. Signal 1, the 2018 declaration of a national emergency. Signal 2, the replacement of the Secretary of Defense